Of course, as mentioned previously, it is Budget Eve. The first budget of the coalition government announced tomorrow afternoon. The problem with that, though, is it kind of dominates the headlines. It kind of sucks the oxygen out of the room for some other important political issues. Joining us to talk not only the budget, but those other important issues, political commentator Dr. Bryce Edwards. Bryce, kia ora, good morning.
Morena, Andrew.
I mean, budget is dominating, but some other important things are continuing to happen. Let's start with those and save some room for the budget rather than the other way around. Sound good?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. What are some of the things that you think we should be paying attention to politically this week?
Well, there's always an issue of how democracy works and how governments, when they finally get their hands on the levers, whether they use those things properly. And increasingly in recent years, with all stripes of governments, there's been more concerns about the integrity and the ethics and of politicians maybe sometimes not following the rules, maybe being biased to vested interests, etc. And this happens on left and right. It's not really something that I would pinpoint on this current government as being different from any others, but we certainly have a few controversies that aren't huge, but they are kind of accumulating into some sort of smelly stuff. I think you'd put it at the moment. No, the big one last week.
Yeah. No, keep going. Sorry.
Was one of the national MPs having to contact the Electoral Commission and say, oops, I forgot to include nearly $200,000 of donations in my disclosure. Which,
now, this is more than an oops, although it is self-declared in this instance rather than somebody else pointing it out, although this may end up in the courts, I understand.
That's right, because he has broken the law. This is David McLeod, the new national MP for New Plymouth. He says he made a mistake, and probably he did. But you don't really have that excuse necessarily when you commit a crime, which this essentially is, saying, well, I didn't know what the rules were, I overlooked this. It still needs potentially a police investigation, and they might decide that it's not in public interest to prosecute. But I think it is important when politicians don't follow the law, especially with something like $200,000 that they could be accused of hiding. That it needs a prosecute. It needs at least a investigation.
Lesson learned the hard way, and hey, listen, for other MPs who may say, oh gosh, I should really check that, but at least not a senior government minister, somebody with a lot more experience. Caught doing something right, though, David Seymour saying, well, hey, look, if I'm going to be involved with Pharmac, I need to get rid of shares in the medical and pharmaceutical industry. Of course, not his first rodeo, but he's doing the right thing on this occasion.
Yeah, just to clarify, it's not his shares, it's one of his MPs. It's Todd Stevenson. He's a new ACT MP, and the Pecuniary Interest Register came out last week, and this has been coming out for about 15 or 20 years, whereby MPs have to declare all their major sort of assets and declare any potential conflicts of interest. And Todd Stevenson, he listed quite a few pharmaceutical and biotech companies that he has a small ownership of, and MPs are allowed to own shares and things. But the problem in this case is that Todd Stevenson has recently been appointed by the government as a parliamentary undersecretary on health. So it's a bit of a quasi-ministerial position, not quite a minister, but he's there to help his leader, David Seymour, on pharmaceutical issues, especially on Pharmac. And so the opposition and some other commentators have said, hey, is that appropriate that he actually is a part owner of pharmaceutical companies while he's officially giving advice to the minister on Pharmac? And so yesterday he decided, well, I don't necessarily agree with those criticisms, but I'm going to sell those shares just to stop this being a distraction.
Again, a new kid on the block excuse, but at least he has a leader who's able to say, hey, actually, let's have a clean slate on this one. And again, slightly awkward that somebody else was pointing out that problem rather than the other way around. On to the budget.
It probably should have
Yeah.
happened before that, but
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
yeah, you're right.
On to the budget, and well, I mean, yes, this is taking all the oxygen out of the room, but even within the budget, anything other than tax cuts and what they're going to have to cut to give the tax cuts, I mean, that's certainly the thing that everybody's talking about at the moment.
Yeah, so tax cuts is the thing to watch tomorrow, amongst other things, but that's the one that I think all three parties, at least National and ACT, campaigned on
Yep.
going into office that they would deliver tax cuts, and they will deliver on that. They've been very clear on that, but they haven't been clear about how they'll pay for them, and the extent of tax cuts, because, depending on how you configure these things, it can be good, more I don't know, valuable for some income earners and less for others. And so they say it's going to be fiscally neutral. And so that'll be very interesting to how they've done that. So it really means that they can't afford to borrow, money to pay for these tax cuts.
And that's new information.
Find savings somewhere else.
That's borrowing is off the table for the tax cuts. That is a relatively recent development. It certainly was one of the things being considered, and it seems a little bit counterintuitive that you would borrow money to reduce your income. But actually, that now that is off the table, that means that savings need to happen somewhere else. You'd be a nervous public servant in Wellington at the moment, I imagine.
Indeed. I mean, there's sometimes semantics about these issues of fiscally neutral, things. And so I think the government are going to end up having to borrow more under this budget because there's a deficit. And, and they can quite rightly point that it's the former government that's produced this deficit, and they need to borrow because they need to keep paying for the hospitals to work and so forth. And so the opponents, especially the Labour Party, will now say, well, if you're borrowing money to keep those hospitals going, but you're also giving tax cuts, essentially you are borrowing for those tax cuts.
Yeah.
And so it's all a bit of a semantic argument, and it will probably put a lot of people off the whole debate about yes, we are, no, we're not, sort of thing.
Exactly.
But they will have to make some cuts elsewhere. It's true. And we already know that the public service is, at least the sort of back office public service, is where the government is aiming for some of these cuts.
Another one of the hints that they've given is, hey, not all public service getting cut. Extra jobs for nurses, extra jobs for frontline police officers. That's been strongly hinted. Anything else that you think is going to be in tomorrow's budget? Anything stand out, Bryce?
Look, it's always a bit of a guess. There might be places where taxes go up. For example, I don't know, maybe Bill English put taxes up on GST when he was dealing with similar problems. So who knows where they'll find a way to do that, and that could hurt some. I don't know, there could be some tax reform. There'll be some surprises, but certainly I'm not expecting this to be a big budget that has a lot of colourful things in it. The government's quite tightly sort of constrained in what they can do. And I think Nicola Willis is really talking, well, she talks about a Goldilocks budget where it's not going to be big cuts and it's not going to be dishing out lots of money either, apart from maybe those tax cuts. So it could be a bit of a boring budget in the middle, but certainly, we're in a time of quite difficult economic conditions. So it's not going to be lots of lollies thrown out.
The problem with the Goldilocks metaphor is we might end up with a burnt mouth and a broken chair. But just finally on this one, because it is Nicola Willis's first budget, and there's a lot riding on this one. But honestly, what sort of opposition is there? The recent State of the Nation address from, the sort of counter budget from Chris Hipkins didn't draw much attention, and certainly the current opposition finance minister is not exactly making headlines either.
This will be a huge test for Barbara Edmonds, the Labour Party finance spokesperson. She is really been quite invisible in the last few months, and so she'll have to answer in Parliament the budget, And I think she's under huge pressure to deliver. So I think you're absolutely right, Andrew, that it's not just the government under scrutiny tomorrow. People want to know, well, if this really is bad, where's the opposition and what are they offering as a alternative?
Yeah, what is the alternative budget, as it were? Hey, we'll be watching and waiting. Bryce, thank you for your insight and your commentary. Thanks for joining us today.
Cheers. Thanks, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.